Dusty Creek thought it knew Abby Thatcher. They called her unwanted. They laughed when her groom ran from the altar. They believed a woman like her could never stand beside a wealthy cowboy like Will Sterling. But small towns have long memories, and even longer shadows. As Abby steps into the Sterling ranch, she must face a dead wife's ghost, a bitter mother-in-law, a cruel society, and a storm that will test whether respect can grow into love. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, please like, comment your thoughts, share the story, and subscribe to help our Western storytelling family grow.
It was the kind of Texas summer heat that melted the wax right off the church candles. But that didn't stop them. Over 200 people packed into the Dusty Creek Church that morning. Pews were full. Folks were standing in the aisles, fanning themselves, whispering. They weren't there to celebrate a union before God. They were there for a show. Abigail Thatcher knew it. She felt it in the way the women behind their lace fans giggled when she walked past. She saw it in the eyes of the men betting pennies by the church door. "Look at the Thatcher girl," they whispered, "the fat bride. Let's see if Elias actually goes through with it." Abby wasn't blind. She knew she was heavy. She was a big, sturdy woman. Her hands were rough from pulling plows and tending dirt since she was old enough to walk. She didn't look like the delicate, corset-pinched girls in the fashion magazines. But as she walked down the aisle, she kept her chin up. She clutched a simple bouquet of wildflowers. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her steps were steady. Waiting at the altar was Elias Thornton. He was 40, balding and sweating through his Sunday suit. He needed a workhorse to keep his house clean. Abby needed a roof over her head so she wouldn't starve. It was a trade, nothing more. But Elias wasn't looking at Abby. He was staring at the third pew. At Clementine, a slim, pretty girl half his age. Reverend Hopkins cleared his throat. The church went dead quiet. You could hear a pin drop on the pine floorboards. If anyone can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together, speak now. Elias flinched. He looked at Abby. Then he looked at Clementine. He took a step back. "I can't," Elias choked out. The silence stretched. It pulled tight, like a wire about to snap. "I'm sorry," Elias stammered, his face red. I can't do it." He turned on his heel. He didn't look back at Abby. He practically ran down the side aisle, grabbing Clementina's hand on the way out. Then the wire snapped. The church erupted. Someone let out a snort, then a chuckle. Then full, cruel laughter echoed off the high wooden beams. 200 people laughing at the heavy girl left alone at the altar. Abby didn't run. She didn't cry. She just stood there, frozen, the wildflowers trembling in her calloused hands. In the very back row, Will Sterling stood up. He hadn't come for the joke. He came out of respect for the Reverend. Will was 38, a widower. He owned the biggest cattle ranch in the county. He kept to himself, carried his own ghosts, and had absolutely no patience for cruelty. He watched the town laugh at a woman whose only crime was hoping for a decent life. He felt his jaw tighten. Will stepped out of his pew. He didn't sneak out the back. He walked straight up the center aisle. His boots thudded heavy and rhythmic against the floor. The laughter started to die down. People moved out of his way. Will reached the altar. He stopped right in front of Abby. He took off his Stetson and held it over his chest. He looked her right in the eye. "Miss Thatcher," Will said. His voice was deep, calm, and loud enough for every single gossip in the room to hear. "I have a carriage waiting right outside. Please allow me to take you home." Abby stared at him. She didn't know him well, but she saw the steady look in his eyes. She nodded, slowly. She took his offered arm. They walked back down the aisle together. Nobody laughed anymore. The town just watched in stunned silence as the wealthy cowboy escorted the chubby bride out into the blinding Texas sun. Will helped her into his carriage. He snapped the reins, and the horses pulled them away from the church, leaving the whispers behind in the dust. They rode in silence for a long time. The wind blew hot across the plains. Finally, Abby looked down at her hands. "You didn't have to do that, Mr. Sterling. They came to laugh at me. They think I'm a joke. A woman my size, thinking she could ever deserve a real wedding or a decent man." Will pulled back on the reins. He brought the carriage to a dead stop in the middle of the prairie. He turned on the seat to face her. "Miss Thatcher, I need you to listen to me carefully," Will said, his voice firm and clear. "Those people did not laugh at you because you are a joke. They laughed because they are small-minded and mean. I want you to learn this right now. A person's worth is never measured by the shape of their body. It is not measured by a tailor's tape or a scale." Abby looked up, her eyes wide. Will pointed a finger back toward the town. "Your value is measured by the strength of your character, by the kindness in your heart. You stood tall at that altar while the whole world tried to break you down for sport. That takes real courage. That takes dignity." He leaned in a little closer. "Human dignity is a basic right. It is not something they can take away from you just by laughing. And you deserve the exact same respect as any other person walking God's green earth. Don't you ever let anyone convince you otherwise. Do you understand me?" Abby let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. A single tear broke loose and tracked through the dust on her cheek. "I understand," she whispered. "Good," Will said. He gave a sharp nod. He picked up the reins again and snapped them over the horses' backs. "Now, let's get you home. 3 days." That was how long it took for a joke to settle into the bones of a small town. Abby Thatcher didn't go into Dusty Creek. She didn't have to. She could feel the gossip drifting across the prairie wind. She knew what they were saying at the general store. She knew what the women were whispering over their laundry. She was the fat girl who got left at the altar. The heavy, ugly thing nobody wanted. Not even an old, desperate clerk. Abby swung the heavy iron mallet. It hit the wooden fence post with a dull, cracking thud. The Texas sun was merciless. It beat down on the back of her neck. Dust coated her skin. Sweat soaked through her faded cotton dress. Her arms burned. Her thick shoulders ached. But she swung the mallet again. Thud. Her father, Thomas, sat on the porch of their falling down shack. He looked older today, grayer. The Thatcher farm was failing. The soil was dry. The bank was circling. Elias Thornton was supposed to be their way out. Elias had promised to pay the back taxes in exchange for Abby. Now, there was no Elias. There was no money. There was only dirt and pride. Abby swung again. Thud. She didn't hear the horse until it was right up on the fence line. She stopped. She leaned on the long handle of the mallet. She wiped her forehead with the back of a dirty, calloused hand. She squinted through the glaring sunlight. Will Sterling sat on a massive roan stallion. He wore a dusty Stetson, a canvas work shirt, and a look of absolute calm. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't sneering. He was just looking at her. "You're going to break that handle, Miss Thatcher," Will said. His voice carried over the hot wind, low and steady. Abby stared back at him. This was the man who had walked her out of the church, the richest man in the county. She didn't know what he wanted. She didn't have the energy to guess. "The post is rotten," Abby said. Her voice was scratchy from the dust. "Ground is baked hard. Takes a heavy squeezing to make it set." Will nodded slowly. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the dirt. He tied his horse to a solid rail. He walked over to her. He didn't look at her ragged dress. He didn't look at her sweating face. He looked at the fence. "I came out here to talk to you," Will said. Abby tightened her grip on the mallet. If you came out here to check on me, Mr. Sterling, save your breath. I'm fine. My pride is bruised, but my back is strong. I'll live. I didn't come to check on your pride, Will said. I came to offer you a job and a name. Eam. Abby frowned. She dropped the mallet in the dirt. A job? Let's sit in the shade, Will said. It wasn't a request. It was a practical suggestion. They walked to a large oak tree near the edge of the property. They sat on two old, overturned water buckets. The shade was cool. The air was quiet. Will took off his hat. He rested his forearms on his knees. My ranch is big, Will started. Over 2,000 acres, 400 head of cattle. I have hands to work the beef, but the house is falling apart. My mother is 65. Her joints are bad. Her temper is worse. I spend my days trying to keep the herd alive, and I come home to a cold stove and a bitter house. I need someone to run it. Abby crossed her arms over her wide chest. You have money, Mr. Sterling. Hire a housekeeper. I don't need a hired hand, Will said flatly. Hired hands quit when my mother yells at them. Hired hands don't care if the foundation rots. I need someone who has a stake in the land. Someone who won't run away when it gets hard. He looked directly into her brown eyes. I am asking you to marry me, Miss Thatcher. Abby stopped breathing. The wind seemed to die down. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance. She looked at Will Sterling. His handsome face, his sharp jaw, the expensive leather of his boots. Then she looked down at her own hands. Rough, thick, stained with mud. You're out of your mind, Abby said. She didn't yell. She just stated a fact. I'm perfectly sane. I'm 34 years old, Abby said, her voice rising just a fraction. I am built like a draft horse. 3 days ago, a man chose to run out of a church rather than marry me. And you sit here, the wealthiest cattleman in Dusty Creek, and ask me to be your wife. Is this a charity project? Do you feel sorry for me? I don't feel sorry for you, Will said. His voice was like stone. I admire you. I saw you stand in that church. I saw you take the worst humiliation a town can throw at a woman, and you didn't break. You didn't beg. You didn't weep. You have gravel in your gut, Abby Thatcher. That is exactly what my ranch needs. Abby stared at him. She didn't know what to do with the truth in his eyes. Let's be clear, Will continued. I am not offering you a grand romance. I was married before. My wife, Sarah, died 3 years ago. I don't have poetry left in me. I am offering you a practical arrangement. A roof over your head, food on your table, respect. In exchange, you manage my household. You care for my mother, and I will pay off your father's back taxes today so he never has to worry about the bank again. Abby looked over at the porch. Her father was asleep in his chair. He looked so frail. The bank would take the farm by winter. They would be out in the cold. She turned back to Will. You say you're offering me a marriage without romance, Abby said slowly. Just a practical trade. You get a manager. I get a house. Yes. Abby sat up straight. She squared her broad shoulders. She looked him dead in the eye. If I do this, Mr. Sterling, we need to have a very clear understanding about what this marriage will be. Because I need to tell you something important. I need you to learn exactly where I stand. Will didn't blink. Tell me. Abby took a deep breath. She spoke loud. She spoke clear. There was no hesitation. I want to teach you right now about what equality means to me, Abby said, enunciating every single word. If I say yes, I am not coming to your ranch as your servant. I am not coming as your property. I am coming as your partner. A marriage must be a partnership of equals. Mr. Sterling, I need you to hear me say this. Just because you have the money and the land does not mean you own my voice or my mind. Equality in a marriage means we make decisions together. It means my labor in the home is valued exactly the same as your labor in the fields. It means you'll never speak down to me, and I will never cower before you. If you want a woman to just nod her head and sweep your floors, go buy a broom. But if you want a wife, you must treat me as an equal human being with equal rights in that household. That is my educational lesson for you today. Do you understand what I am telling you? Will sat perfectly still. He let her words echo in the hot air. He didn't look angry. He didn't look offended. In fact, the corners of his mouth twitched up. Just a fraction. I understand you perfectly, Will said, and I agree completely. I am asking for a partner. Nothing less. Equality is exactly what I am offering. Abby looked at him. She searched his face for a lie. She found none. She stood up. She smoothed down her dirty skirt. All right, Mr. Sterling, Abby said. Pay off my father's debt. I will marry you on Friday. Will stood up. He put his hat back on. He tipped the brim. I'll see you Friday, partner, he said. He walked back to his horse. Abby watched him right away. She picked up her mallet. She turned back to the fence post. She swung hard. Thud. Only this time she didn't feel so tired. There was no white dress. There were no wildflowers. There was no crowd. Abby wore her best Sunday dress. It was dark blue. It was plain. It fit her wide frame snugly. They stood in Reverend Hopkinson's small office. Thomas Thatcher stood in the corner, holding his hat, tears in his eyes. He wasn't crying from sadness. He was crying because the bank had torn up his foreclosure papers that morning. Will wore a clean black suit. He stood tall. He spoke his vows in a clear, deep voice. Abby spoke hers right back. She didn't shake. She didn't stumble. I pronounce you husband and wife, the Reverend said. They didn't kiss. They just turned and walked out the door. The carriage ride to the Sterling Ranch took an hour. The land seemed to stretch out forever. Rolling hills, endless prairie grass, cattle grazing as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Then the house appeared over the ridge. It was massive. 2 stories of solid oak and white paint. A wraparound porch. Big glass windows. It looked like a mansion compared to the Thatcher shack. Will pulled the carriage up to the front steps. He stepped down and offered Abby his hand. She took it. His grip was strong, warm. Welcome home, he said. They walked up the steps. The front door opened before they reached it. Standing in the doorway was Josephine Sterling. She was a tall, thin woman. She wore a stiff black dress with a high collar. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun. She leaned on a silver-tipped cane. Her eyes were ice blue, and they swept over Abby from head to toe. They didn't miss a single inch of Abby's bulk. So, Josephine said. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping on a stone. This is the new Mrs. Will step forward. Mother, this is Abigail. She is my wife. You will treat her with respect. Josephine sniffed. She didn't step aside. She just stared at Abby. Sarah used to wear silk on Fridays. Josephine said softly. The name hung in the air. A ghost summoned instantly to the porch. Sarah was as thin as a willow branch. She played the piano in the parlor. She made this house sing. Will tensed. His jaw locked. Mother, that's enough. Abby put a hand on Will's arm. She stopped him from stepping forward. She looked straight at the old woman. Hello, Mrs. Sterling, Abby said gently. I am not Sarah. I don't own any silk. I have the musical talent of a bullfrog. But I can make a beef stew that will stick to your ribs, and I can scrub a floor until you can see your face in it. I am not here to replace the ghost in your house. I am here to work. Josephine blinked. The harshness in her eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted. A tiny flicker of surprise. We'll see, Josephine muttered. She turned and hobbled back into the dark hallway. The first week was exhausting. Abby didn't stop moving. The house was grand, but it had been neglected. Dust coated the baseboards. The windows were smudged. The meals had been cooked by Hank, a ranch hand whose idea of dinner was burning a piece of meat, boiling potatoes into mush. Abby took over the kitchen. On Tuesday, she made a thick chicken and dumpling stew. When the ranch hands, Hank, Pedro, and Boy came in for dinner, they stopped dead in their tracks. The kitchen smelled like heaven. They sat down. They ate in silence. They cleaned their plates. Hank looked up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Ma'am," Hank said, tipping his invisible hat. "That is the best thing I've put in my mouth in 3 years." Abby smiled. It was a small victory. But the real work was out back, the garden. Behind the kitchen was a large patch of dirt. It was choked with dead weeds, thorny brush, and rocks. It used to be a garden. Now it was a graveyard for dead plants. Abby attacked it. Every morning after breakfast was served and the dishes were scrubbed, she went out back. She tied an apron over her dress. She put on thick leather gloves. She got down on her hands and knees in the dirt. She pulled weeds until her knuckles bled. She hauled heavy buckets of water from the well. She swung a hoe to break up the rock-hard Texas clay. The Texas sun beat down. Abby sweated. She grunted. She worked until her muscles trembled. Will watched her from the barn. He saw the sheer physical force of his new wife. He saw her broad back bending over the soil. He saw the determination in her jaw. He didn't interrupt her. He just watched. By the end of the second week, the garden was cleared. The soil was turned. She planted tomatoes, beans, squash, and a long row of sunflower seeds along the back fence. It was Friday afternoon. Abby was inside, cleaning the back storage room. It was a room filled with old coats, broken chairs, and dusty boxes. She was wiping down a high wooden shelf when her rag hit something heavy. She pulled it down. It was a beautiful, dark mahogany box. It had brass hinges, and carved into the lid in elegant swirling letters was the name Sarah. Abby froze. The box was heavy. It was locked with a tiny brass keyhole. She stared at the carved letters. This was her predecessor, the elegant and musical ghost that still haunted her husband's eyes and her mother-in-law's voice. Abby didn't shake it. She didn't try to pry the lid open. She didn't even run her fingers over the carving. She took a clean corner of her rag. She gently wiped the dust off the top of the box. Carefully, respectfully then, she reached up and placed the box exactly back where she had found it, right in the center of the shelf. "You didn't open it." Abby gasped and spun around. Will was standing in the doorway. He had his hat in his hand. He was covered in dust from the trail. He was looking up at the shelf and then down at Abby. "I didn't hear you come in," Abby said, her heart hammering. "It's not locked," Will said quietly. "The lock is broken. You could have opened it. You could have looked inside. Most people would have." Abby wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at Will. He looked tired. There were deep shadows under his eyes. "Mr. Sterling," Abby said, "we need to talk about this right now." Will leaned against the doorframe. "Talk? Talk." Abby stood up straight. She pointed at the box on the shelf. "I need to tell you a very clear lesson about human boundaries," Abby said firmly. "I want you to listen to the words I am saying. Respecting another human being means respecting their private grief. That box does not belong to me. The memories inside that box do not belong to me. They belong to Sarah, and they belong to you." Will didn't move. He just watched her face. Abby took a step toward him. Her voice was strong, carrying the full weight of her conviction. "Let me be completely explicit," Abby continued. "I believe that every person has a right to their own history, a right to their own pain. Prying into someone else's past without their permission is a violation of their dignity. I will never cross that line. I will never rummage through your grief to satisfy my own curiosity. I am your partner in the present, and I will be your partner in the future. But your past is yours. It is sacred, and I will always respect the boundaries of your heart and the memory of the woman who came before me. Do you understand this lesson I am giving you? Will closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, the darkness seemed a little less heavy. The tension in his shoulders dropped. He walked into the small room. He stopped right in front of her. He looked down into her wide, earnest face. I hear you, Will said softly. I understand exactly what you are saying. And Abby? Yes? Thank you. Will turned and walked out of the room. Abby stood alone in the dusty storage space. She looked back up at the mahogany box. The house was quiet, but for the first time since she arrived, it didn't feel so cold. She turned around, picked up her bucket, and went back to the kitchen. There was a garden to water and a home to build. August came in hot, the kind of heat that bakes the ground solid, the kind that makes the cattle stand dead still in the creek water. The ranch settled into a rhythm. Abby woke at 4. She lit the stove. She kneaded dough. By the time the sun peeked over the eastern ridge, breakfast was on the table. Heavy plates of eggs, thick-cut bacon, and biscuits. Will ate with his men. He was quiet, but things were changing. Slowly, he didn't rush out the door anymore. He lingered. He'd wrap his large, scarred hands around a tin cup of black coffee. He'd sit at the head of the table. He'd listen to Abby talk. She talked about the garden, about the squash vines taking hold, about a stubborn hen in the coop. Simple things, real things. Will listened. The tight lines around his eyes would loosen, just for a minute. Then came the second week of August. The heat broke, but a heavy, invisible pressure settled over the house. Josephine stopped coming out of her room. The ranch hands kept their heads down. They didn't joke in the yard. And Will turned to stone. He stopped eating. He'd just stare at his plate. His jaw locked. His eyes looked hollow. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. He stayed out on the range late into the night. Abby noticed. Of course she did. She was observant. She asked Hank about it by the water pump. Hank took off his hat. He wrung it in his hands. It's the anniversary, ma'am. Thursday makes 3 years. Since Miss Sarah passed. Abby nodded. She didn't pry. She went back to the kitchen. Thursday night was suffocating. The air was thick. Will sat on the front porch. The house was pitch black behind him. He just stared out into the empty prairie. He looked like a man drowning on dry land. Abby boiled water. She pinched dried chamomile and willow bark into a mug. She walked out onto the porch. The floorboards creaked. Will didn't turn around. Abby sat down on the wooden bench next to him. She didn't crowd him. She just set the steaming mug on the railing beside his hand. They sat in silence. The crickets chirped. A coyote howled far off in the hills. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Will finally reached out. He took the mug. He held it, letting the heat seep into his palms. I wasn't there, Will said. His voice was a raspy whisper. It sounded like sandpaper on raw wood. Abby didn't say anything. She just listened. She was sick for 6 months, Will went on. A slow, terrible fever. It burned her away from the inside. I brought every doctor in the county. Nothing worked. So, I worked. He let out a shaky breath. I went out to the fields. I drove the herd. I fixed fences. I told myself that if I just kept the ranch running, if I just worked hard enough, God wouldn't take her. I thought my sweat could buy her life. Will closed his eyes. The pain on his face was agonizing. She died on a Tuesday afternoon. I was 3 miles away, pulling a calf out of a mud pit. I wasn't holding her hand. She died in an empty room. I left her alone. The guilt poured off him in waves. It was heavy. It was suffocating. It was a burden he had carried for 3 long years. Will set the mug down. He put his head in his hands. I can't forgive myself, he whispered. I don't deserve to. Abby sat up straight. She turned to face him in the dark. She didn't reach out to pat his shoulder. She didn't offer empty comforts. She prepared to speak. She needed him to hear the truth. Will, look at me, Abby said. Her voice was firm. It cut through the thick night air. He lifted his head. His eyes were red. I need to give you a very clear lesson about grief and guilt, Abby said, speaking slowly, making sure every word landed. I need you to listen to what I am saying. Grief is not a debt that you have to pay with the rest of your life. Carrying this crushing guilt does not prove that you loved Sarah more. It only stops you from living the life you have left. Will swallowed hard, staring at her. Abby leaned forward. Let me be entirely explicit about this. Torturing yourself is not an act of devotion. It is an act of self-destruction. You work the fields because that is what men on this frontier are taught to do. You tried to provide. You tried to hold the world together with your bare hands. That is not a sin. It is human. She pointed a finger at his chest, right over his heart. You need to learn that forgiveness is necessary for survival. Sarah did not die to become an anchor that drags you to the bottom of the ocean. The true measure of a man is not how much pain he can carry in silence. The true measure of a man is his willingness to forgive himself when he fails, so he can stand back up and care for the living. Do you hear the lesson I am giving you? You must drop this stone. You must forgive yourself. It is your moral obligation to live. Will stared at her. The crickets seemed to stop chirping. The wind died down. His chest heaved. A single sob broke free from his throat. He covered his mouth with his hand. The great, stoic cowboy shattered right there on the porch. Abby didn't look away. She sat with him. She let him break. After a long time, Will wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. He stood up. He walked into the house. Abby stayed on the porch. She thought she had pushed too hard. She thought she had driven him away. But a moment later, the screen door groaned. Will walked back out. He held the mahogany box, the one with Sarah's name carved into it. He sat back down. He put the box on the bench between them. You didn't open it, Will said softly, when you found it. It wasn't mine, Abby said. Will reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small brass key. He put it in the lock. It clicked open. He lifted the heavy wooden lid. Inside, resting on faded blue velvet, were 3 folded pieces of parchment. The paper was yellowed. The ink was faded. Will picked them up. His hands shook slightly. He held them out to Abby. These aren't for me, Will said. Abby frowned. What do you mean? She wrote these in her last month, Will said. When she knew she wasn't going to make it, she gave the box to my mother. She told her to give it to the woman who came after. Abby felt her heart skip a beat. She looked at the letters. Me, yes, Will said. Read them. Abby hesitated. Then she reached out and took the letters. She unfolded the first one. She held it up to the pale moonlight. The handwriting was shaky, frail, but the words were clear. To the woman reading this, the letter began. Welcome to the house I loved. Please, do not try to be me. Be yourself. Will is a stubborn man. He locks his feelings away. But he listens better than anyone I know. If you want him to understand you, just speak the absolute truth. He only respects the truth. Abby swallowed a lump in her throat. She opened the second letter. Josephine will be hard on you. Do not let her break your spirit. She is acting out of fear, not malice. It took me a year to make her smile. Have patience. Then she opened the third. It was the shortest. Tell Will I forgive him for being out in the mud. Tell him I loved him, and tell him I expect him to build a good life with you. Do not let him drown in his own silence. Save him so he can save you." Abby lowered the letters. Tears blurred her vision. She looked at Will. Will was watching her. The heavy, dark shadow that had clouded his eyes for 3 years was cracking. The light was bleeding in. "She knew," Abby whispered. "She knew you would blame yourself." "Yes," Will said. His voice was steady now. "And she knew I needed someone strong enough to tell me the truth. You just did." Will reached out. He placed his large, warm hand over Abby, his rough, calloused fingers. He didn't pull away. "Thank you, Abby," Will said. He didn't say he loved her. It wasn't the time for that. But as they sat on the porch, their hands resting together on top of Sarah's letters, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of respect. It was full of healing. It was the foundation of a real home. September brought cooler winds, but it didn't cool the gossip in Dusty Creek. Abby had avoided the town for nearly 3 months. She had everything she needed on the ranch. She had her garden, and she had the house. She had a husband who looked at her with growing respect every single day. But flour runs out, sugar runs out, and Josephine needed her specific tonic from the apothecary. "I'll take the wagon," Abby told Will over breakfast. "Hank has enough to do mending the north fence. I can handle a team of horses." Will looked up from his coffee. He studied her. "You sure? I can ride in with you." "I'm a grown woman, Will," Abby said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm not afraid of a general store." Will gave a slow nod. "All right, put the supplies on the Sterling account." An hour later, Abby drove the buckboard wagon into Dusty Creek. The town was small. A single main street lined with wooden boardwalks. A bank, a saloon, a livery stable, and the mercantile. Abby tied the horses to the hitching post. She smoothed down her plain brown dress. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and stepped onto the boardwalk. She felt the eyes immediately. Men on the saloon porch stopped talking. Women sweeping their storefronts paused. They stared. Abby ignored them. She walked straight into the mercantile. The bell above the door jingled. The smell of ground coffee, leather, and peppermint candy filled the air. Standing by the bolt fabrics was Clara Cole, the mayor's wife. She was a thin, sharp-featured woman in a pristine, ruffled silk dress. She was flanked by 2 other wealthy women from the town's social circle. When Abby walked in, the 3 women went dead silent. Then, Clara Cole let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Well," Clara said. She didn't lower her voice. She wanted Abby to hear. "I see the Sterling workhorses come into town to feed." One of the other women giggled behind a gloved hand. "I still can't believe Will married it. He must have been truly desperate for a cook." "It's a tragedy," Clara continued, fingering a bolt of lace. "A handsome, wealthy man like William, reduced to taking in the town's leftovers just to get his floors scrubbed. She looks like a walking barn." Abby stopped in the middle of the aisle. She held a list of supplies in her hand. Her knuckles turned white. The shopkeeper, Mr. Higgins, looked down at his ledger. He didn't want any trouble. Abby felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Her old instinct was to shrink, to apologize, to run back to the wagon and hide. Then she thought of Will. She thought of the way he listened to her, the way he treated her as an equal. Abby turned around. She walked directly over to Clara Cole. She planted her heavy boots firmly on the floorboards. She towered over the thin, cruel woman. Clara took a nervous step back, her sneer faltering. "Mrs. Cole," Abby said. Her voice was calm. It didn't shake. It rang out through the quiet store. "I have something to say to you," Abby began, making sure every person in the store could hear her. I need you to learn a very specific lesson about human dignity today. I want you to listen carefully to these words. Clara lifted her chin defensively. I don't need lessons from a farm girl. Yes, you do, Abby said firmly. You need to learn that a person's elegance is not measured by the circumference of her corset or the price of her silk dress. True elegance is measured by how you treat the people around you. Mocking another woman's body in public does not make you look superior, Mrs. Cole. It makes you look remarkably small and incredibly bitter. Abby took a step closer, looking down into Clara's shocked face. Let me be perfectly explicit, Abby continued. My husband did not buy a cook. He married a partner. He chose a woman who understands hard work, loyalty, and respect. Those are qualities you clearly know nothing about. You believe your money gives you the right to strip away my human dignity. It does not. I demand the basic respect that every human being deserves. And if you cannot offer that, then you are the poorest woman in this entire town. The store was dead silent. Clara Cole's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Her face turned bright crimson. She spun around, grabbed her skirts, and stormed out of the store. Her friends hurried out right behind her. Abby took a deep breath. She smoothed her skirt. She walked up to the counter. 10 pounds of flour, Mr. Higgins, Abby said calmly, and put it on the Sterling account. She drove the wagon back to the ranch an hour later. She felt a little shaky, but she held her head high. She had defended her own worth. She didn't tell Will what happened. She unpacked the wagon. She started dinner, but small town talk. Late that afternoon, Hank rode back from the livery stable in town. He walked straight into the barn where Will was mending a saddle. Hank leaned against a post. He spit a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Boss, Hank said. Town's buzzing like a hornet's nest. Will didn't look up. About what? Your wife? Hank said. Will stopped pulling the leather strap. He looked up. His eyes turned sharp. What about my wife? Hank told him. He repeated what Clara Cole had said, and he repeated, word for word, the dressing down Abby had given her in front of the whole store. Will didn't say a word. He stood up. He threw the saddle over the wooden sawhorse. He walked to his roan stallion. He threw a blanket on its back. He tossed a heavy riding saddle over it and cinched it tight. Boss? He asked, stepping back. Where are you going? To teach a lesson of my own, Will said. Will rode into Dusty Creek like a thunderstorm. He didn't stop at the Mercantile. He rode straight to the Dusty Creek Bank, the biggest brick building in town. Owned and operated by Mayor William Cole. Clara's husband, Will, tied his horse. He kicked open the heavy oak doors of the bank. The tellers jumped. Will Sterling was the bank's biggest client. His cattle money kept the town afloat. Will bypassed the tellers. He walked straight into Mayor Cole's private office. Cole looked up from his desk, surprised. Will, good to see you. What brings... Shut your mouth and listen to me, William, Will said. His voice was deadly quiet. It was far scarier than if he had yelled. Will stepped up to the mahogany desk. He leaned over it, planting his fists on the wood. I need to give you an explicit lesson on respect and consequences, Will said slowly, his eyes boring into Cole's. I want you to take this lesson home to your wife. You will learn today what happens when you attack my family. Cole swallowed hard. He started to sweat. Will, I don't know what... I am talking, Will snapped. You will listen. My wife, Abigail, is the master of my house. She is my equal partner in all things. Your wife decided to mock her physical appearance in public today. She decided to treat my wife like an animal. Let me be very clear about my educational value here, William. A society that tolerates the public humiliation of its citizens is a diseased society. Human respect is not optional. Will stood up straight. He looked around the opulent office. You hold my operating accounts here, Will said. Nearly $40,000. If I ever, and I mean ever hear, that your wife, or anyone else in your circle, speaks a single disrespectful word to Abigail again, I will withdraw every single penny. I will move my money to Dallas. I will collapse this bank, and I will dry up this town. Do you understand the lesson I am teaching you? Cole was pale as a ghost. He nodded frantically. Yes, yes, Will, I understand. I will speak to Clara immediately. I am so sorry. Don't apologize to me, Will said. Just make sure it never happens again. Will turned and walked out of the bank. The next Sunday, Will didn't go out to the range. He put on his black suit. He told Abby to put on her best dress. Where are we going? Abby asked. Church, Will said. He drove her into town himself. When they pulled up to the church, the entire town was gathered outside, waiting to see the fallout, waiting to see if the Sterlings were broken. Will stepped down from the carriage. He didn't walk ahead of her. He walked around to her side. He offered his hand. Abby took it. She stepped down. Will didn't let go of her hand. Right there, in front of the mayor, in front of Clara Cole, in front of everyone who had laughed at her 3 months ago, Will Sterling laced his fingers through hers. He held her hand tightly, proudly. He walked her up the steps and through the front doors. He didn't need to say a word. The action spoke for itself, but he had already delivered the verbal lessons that mattered. He had laid the law down in the bank, and Abby had laid it down in the store. They sat in the front pew, together, equals, and nobody in Dusty Creek ever dared to laugh at the chubby bride again. October brought a false peace. The Texas air cooled. The harsh glare of the summer sun softened into a golden haze. Abby's garden was a triumph. The tomato vines sagged under the weight of heavy red fruit. The squash swelled in the dirt, and the sunflowers along the back fence stood 10 feet tall. Their thick stalks were like wooden posts. Their bright yellow heads tracked the sun all day. Things inside the house felt different, too. The heavy, suffocating silence was gone. Will didn't hide in the fields until dark anymore. He came home. He washed his hands at the pump. He sat at the kitchen table while Abby cooked. He asked her opinion on the winter feed. He listened when she told him about the price of seed in town. They were building something. It wasn't built on romance. It was built on respect. It was built on two people pulling the same wagon in the exact same direction. But in Texas, peace is usually just a pause. It is a deep breath before a hard punch. The punch came on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky didn't just get cloudy. It bruised. A deep, ugly purple spread across the western horizon. Then the purple turned black. A solid wall of ink rolling over the prairie. The wind stopped dead. The air grew heavy. It tasted like copper and dry dirt. Abby stepped out onto the back porch. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the sky. She felt the hairs on her arms stand up. The birds were gone. The insects were silent. Will rode into the yard at a hard gallop. His roan stallion was lathered in sweat. He didn't bother tying the horse. He jumped off. He ran toward the barn. He yelled for his men. Get your slickers, Will roared. Saddle fresh horses. We have a blue norther coming in fast. The herd is grazing on the open flat. If that lightning starts hitting the ground, they're going to stampede straight into the canyon. We have to move them to the low ravine. Now, Hank, Pedro, and Boy ran out of the bunkhouse. They didn't ask questions. They moved. Will turned and saw Abby on the porch. He jogged over to her. Lock the shutters, Will said. His voice was rushed, urgent. Tie down anything loose in the yard. Get the animals in the barn. Stay inside. Keep Mother away from the windows. Be careful, Abby said. It wasn't a plea, it was a firm instruction. Always, Will said. He pulled his hat down tight. He turned and ran back to the horses. 5 minutes later, the men were gone. They rode out into the darkening plain. Then the storm hit. It didn't rain first. The wind struck. It hit the house like a solid fist. Oak beams groaned. The glass panes rattled in their frames. Dust blew through the cracks in the floorboards. Abby moved fast. She secured the yard. She locked the heavy wooden shutters. The house was plunged into darkness, lit only by the flickering oil lamps. The rain followed the wind. It didn't fall from the sky. It drove sideways. It beat against the siding like handfuls of gravel. Abby went to the parlor. Josephine was sitting in her high-backed chair. The old woman's face was pale. Her hands gripped the armrests tight. Her knuckles were white. "Where is William?" Josephine asked. Her voice shook. "Out with the herd," Abby said. She lit another lamp. She set it on the table. "He'll be killed," Josephine whispered. "A horse will break a leg in a prairie dog hole. The lightning will strike him. He shouldn't be out there." "He knows the land, Mrs. Sterling," Abby said calmly. "He knows what he is doing." Thunder cracked. It sounded like a cannon firing right over the roof. The floor shook. Josephine gasped and closed her eyes tight. Abby sat down across from her. She didn't pace. She didn't wring her hands. She sat perfectly still. She let her calm anchor the room. 2 hours passed. The storm didn't let up. The rain pounded relentlessly. Abby was boiling water in the kitchen for tea. She stood by the iron stove. The fire snapped inside. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the kitchen burst open. Wind and rain howled into the room. The lamps flickered wildly. Hank stood in the doorway. He was drenched. His face was smeared with dark mud. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, and his hands were covered in bright red blood. "Ma'am," Hank shouted over the roar of the storm, "we need help now." Abby didn't drop the kettle. She set it down smoothly. She turned. "Bring him in." Pedro and Boy stepped through the door. They were carrying Will. Will's head rolled to the side. He was unconscious. His face was the color of dirt chalk. His oilskin coat was torn to shreds on the left side. Beneath it, his shirt was soaked into dark, spreading stain. A dead oak snapped in the wind, Hank yelled, pushing the door shut against the gale. Branch the size of a wagon axle came down, spooked the herd, spooked his horse, threw him right into the timber. A jagged branch caught him in the shoulder and chest, tore him open. "Put him on the kitchen table," Abby ordered. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't scream. The panic of a lady vanished. The hard, practical survival of a farm girl took over completely. The men hauled Will onto the sturdy wooden table. He groaned, a low, wet sound. Josephine stumbled into the kitchen. She saw her son. She saw the blood dripping onto the floorboards. Josephine screamed. It was a high, hissing sound of pure terror. "My boy, he's dying. Oh, God, he's bleeding to death." The old woman sagged against the doorframe, weeping hysterically. The three ranch hands froze. They were tough men. They could brand a calf and break a wild Mustang. But the sight of their boss bleeding out and his mother screaming paralyzed them. Abby stepped up to the table. "Hank," Abby said sharply. Her voice cracked like a bullwhip. "Go to the stove. Keep that water boiling. Pedro, run upstairs to my room. Get the wooden sewing box on my dresser. Boy, go to the cellar. Bring up the strongest jug of whiskey you can find. Move!" The men snapped out of their shock. They ran to obey her orders. Abby leaned over Will. She pulled a clean knife from the block. She cut away the ruined coat. She sliced open his bloody shirt and peeled it back. The wound was ugly, deep. It ran from his collarbone down toward his ribs. The flesh was torn and jagged. Mud and splinters of wood were ground into the bleeding muscle. He was losing blood fast. Pedro ran back in with the sewing box. Boy sprinted up from the cellar with a heavy clay jug. "Pour the whiskey over my hands," Abby told Pedro. Pedro poured. The alcohol stung her calluses. She shook her hands dry. "Now," Abby said, looking down at Will. "Pour it directly into the wound, all of it." Boy hesitated. "Ma'am, that's going to hurt him terrible. If it doesn't get clean, the rot will kill him by Friday," Abby said. "Pour." Boy tilted the jug. The raw liquor splashed into the open wound. Will's eyes flew open. He didn't scream. He roared. It was an animal sound of pure agony. His body arched off the table. He thrashed wildly. "Hold him down," Abby shouted. Hank and Pedro grabbed Will's arms. Boy pinned his legs. They pressed their heavy weight onto him, holding him flat against the blood-stained wood. Will's eyes rolled back. He passed out again from the pain. His body went limp. "Good," Abby breathed. She took a clean rag. She dipped it in the boiling water. She worked her fingers into the torn flesh. She picked out the splinters of wood. She wiped away the mud. She worked quickly, brutally, efficiently. Josephine slid on the wall. She sat on the floor, sobbing into her hands. She couldn't watch. Abby opened her sewing box. She didn't have fine surgical silk. She had thick, heavy thread meant for mending canvas sacks and denim pants. She threaded a curved needle. She dipped it in the whiskey. She leaned over her husband. She pinched the edges of the torn flesh together. She pushed the needle through. It was hard work. The skin was tough. She had to push with force, stitch by stitch, pulling tight, knotting the thread. Her hands were slick with his blood. Her knuckles ached. The kitchen was thick with the smell of copper, sweat, and cheap alcohol. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, Abby fought a war of her own. It took 30 minutes. 30 minutes of absolute focus. When she tied the final knot, Will's breathing was shallow, but the heavy bleeding had stopped. The jagged tear was pulled tight under a long line of thick black stitches. Abby took a clean linen towel. She pressed it firmly over the stitches. "Wrap him," Abby told the men. "Tight around the chest, then carry him upstairs to my bed." The men bound him in clean bandages. They lifted him gently. They carried him out of the kitchen. Abby stayed behind. She stood alone in the kitchen. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline was leaving her veins. Her dress was ruined, covered in dark stains. She walked over to the water basin. She plunged her hands in. The water instantly turned pink. She scrubbed her skin. Josephine was still sitting on the floor by the door. She had stopped sobbing. She was watching Abby. The old woman grabbed her cane. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up from the floor. She leaned heavily on the wood. She walked slowly across the kitchen. She stopped right beside Abby. Abby didn't look up. She kept scrubbing the blood out from under her fingernails. "Mrs. Sterling," Abby said softly, "you should go lie down. He is resting now. The worst is over." "No," Josephine said. Her dry, raspy voice was unusually loud. It carried a strange weight. Abby turned her head. Josephine was staring at her. The old woman's pale blue eyes were wide. They were stripped of their usual arrogance. They were stripped of their harsh judgment. "I need to speak to you," Josephine said. She planted her cane firmly on the floorboards. She stood as tall as she could manage. "I need to give you a very clear, explicit lesson about my own ignorance," Josephine stated. She spoke slowly, making sure her words echoed in the quiet kitchen. "I want you to listen to exactly what I am saying to you. For the past 3 months, I have judged you. I looked at your size. I looked at your rough hands. I looked at your plain dresses. I told myself that you were not good enough for my son because you lacked the delicate refinement of the wealthy class. Josephine pointed a trembling finger at the blood-stained kitchen table. I need you to learn the educational value of what just happened in this room, Josephine continued, her voice rising with fierce conviction. Just watched the delicate refinement of my class fail completely. If my first daughter-in-law or any of those fine ladies from town had been here today, my son would be dead on that table. They would have swooned. They would have wept. They would have been utterly useless. Josephine took a step closer to Abby. She looked directly into Abby's dark, tired eyes. Let me state this moral truth very clearly, Josephine said firmly. A person's true value is never determined by their physical appearance or the cost of their clothes. Human worth is proven by action. It is proven by courage. It is proven by a person's ability to stand strong and hold a family together when the entire world is falling apart. You did not panic. You saved my son's life with your bare hands. You have more dignity, more value, and more true nobility in your calloused fingers than any wealthy woman in this county. Do you hear the lesson I am speaking to you? I was wrong. You are more magnificent, and I am deeply, profoundly grateful that you are my daughter. Abby stared at the old woman. She had expected anger. She had expected criticism for treating Will so roughly. She had not expected total, absolute surrender. Abby dried her hands on a towel. She didn't smile. It wasn't a moment for smiling. She just nodded her head, accepting the truth of the words. I hear your lesson, Mother, Abby said quietly. It was the first time she had used the word. Josephine closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her wrinkled cheek. She nodded back. Then she turned and limped slowly out of the kitchen. Abby went upstairs. The bedroom was dark. The storm outside was finally beginning to slow. The wind lost its howl. The rain settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof. Will lay in the center of Abby's large bed. He was burning with fever. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. Abby pulled a chair right up to the edge of the mattress. She sat down. She took a cool, damp cloth and laid it across his forehead. She sat there for hours. She listened to the storm die away. She listened to his breathing steady. The fever broke just before dawn. His skin cooled. His breathing deepened into real sleep. The gray light of morning crept through the cracks in the shutters. Will stirred, groaned softly. His head turned on the pillow. Abby leaned forward. Will? She whispered. His eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain, but the wild fever was gone. He blinked, trying to focus in the dim light. He looked around the room. Then he looked at her. He saw her ruined dress. He saw the dark circles under her eyes. He felt the tight pulling of the heavy thread across his chest. Will didn't ask what happened. He was a rancher. He knew what a wound felt like. He knew who had stitched it. He moved his right arm. It was slow. It was weak. But he reached across the blankets. He found Abby's hand resting on the edge of the bed. He wrapped his thick fingers around hers. He held her hand tight. Abby, Will rasped. His throat was dry. He didn't call her Miss Thatcher. He didn't call her his manager. I'm right here, Abby said. Will looked at her, really looked at her. I need to state a fact to you, Will whispered. His voice was incredibly weak, but his words were deliberate. He wanted to make sure she heard him. I need you to learn something. I am a man who thought he didn't need anybody. I thought I could survive on my own strength. But I am telling you explicitly right now that no one survives this life alone. You kept me alive. You are my partner, and I trust you with my life. That is the truth. Abby squeezed his hand back. Get some sleep, partner, Abby said gently. The storm is over. Will closed his eyes. He didn't let go of her hand. He held on to her like an anchor. And for the first time in 3 years, Will Sterling slept without a single nightmare. November came to Texas with a bite. The wind changed. It stopped blowing hot dust. It started carrying the sharp, clean chill of winter. The Sterling ranch adapted. The cattle grew thick coats. The horses got frisky in the cold morning air. Besides, the fire burned all day in the great stone hearth. Will was healing. It was a slow process. The gash across his chest was an ugly, puckered scar. It pulled tight when he reached too high. It ached when the temperature dropped. But he was alive. He was on his feet. He didn't take Abby for granted. Not anymore. He watched her now. Really watched her. He saw how she moved through the house. Solid. Steady. Unbreakable. She didn't flutter. She didn't complain. She just did the work that kept them all breathing. They sat on the porch one cold Tuesday afternoon. Will had a heavy wool blanket draped over his shoulders. Abby sat beside him on the wooden bench. She was knitting a thick winter sock. The needles clicked, a quiet, rhythmic sound. The yard was still. Hank was in the barn. Pedro and Boy were out riding the fence line. Then the dog barked. A lone rider was coming up the long dirt driveway. Will squinted against the pale afternoon sun. He leaned forward. His hand instinctively rested on the porch rail. The rider was moving slow. The horse looked dead on its feet. Its head hung low. Its ribs showed. The man on its back didn't look much better. He was slouched over, defeated. As the horse got closer, the details came into focus. The Man SS suit was filthy. It was covered in mud and grease. The knees were torn. He didn't have a hat. His hair was greasy and plastered to his forehead. Abby's knitting needles stopped clicking. She stared at the man. She felt a cold knot form in her stomach. It wasn't the winter wind. It was memory. It was Elias Thornton, the man who had left her standing at the altar. The man who had turned her into the biggest joke in Dusty Creek. Will recognized him a second later. Will stood up. The wool blanket fell from his shoulders to the porch floor. He didn't pick it up. His face turned to stone. The deep, dark anger that Will Sterling kept buried under his ribs flared straight to life. Elias pulled the exhausted horse to a halt at the edge of the yard. He slid out of the saddle. His legs wobbled. He nearly fell into the dirt. He caught himself on the hitching post. He looked up at the porch. He looked pathetic. He looked like a whipped dog. Elias swallowed hard. He took a hesitant step toward the house. Will stepped right to the edge of the stairs. He blocked the path. He stood tall, broad, dangerous. "That is exactly far enough, Thornton," Will said. His voice wasn't loud. It was deadly quiet. It cut through the cold air like a razor. Elias stopped instantly. He held up his hands, palms out. They were shaking. "Sterson, Elias Sterling." His voice was cracked, dry. "Please, I don't mean any harm." "I don't care what you mean," Will said. "You have 10 seconds to get back on that dying animal and ride off my land. If you're still standing there on the 11th second, I will have Hank drag you behind a horse all the way to the county line." Elias dropped his hands. Tears welled up in his eyes. "I have nowhere to go," Elias begged. He let out a pathetic sob. "Clementine, she left me. The money ran out. She took my pocket watch. She took the deed to my grandfather's house. I have nothing left. The town won't even sell me a loaf of bread. Mayor Cole ran me out." Will's expression didn't change. Not a single muscle moved. 8 seconds, Will said. Elias dropped to his knees in the dirt. "Please," Elias cried out. He looked past Will. He looked directly at Abby. "Abby, Abigail, please. I know I was wrong. I know what I did was a terrible, wicked thing. I was a fool. I was bewitched by that girl. I was stupid. I'm so sorry. I am begging you. Just a job. Mucking stalls. Shoveling manure. I'll sleep in the dirt. Just don't let me starve. The yard went dead quiet. Hank stepped out of the barn. He held a pitchfork. He saw Elias. He spit in the dirt and started walking toward the porch. He was ready to throw the trash out. Will reached down to his belt. He didn't wear a gun on the ranch. He didn't need one. He had his fists, and his fists were balling up tight. He took a step down the stairs. He was going to end this right now. He was going to protect his wife. But then he stopped. Will froze on the first step. He looked back over his shoulder. He looked at Abby. She was still sitting on the bench. Her hands were resting in her lap. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set tight. Her eyes were locked on the pathetic man kneeling in the dirt. Will looked at her, and he remembered the conversation they had in the dust by her father's broken fence. I am coming as your partner. He remembered the conversation they had about the wooden box. Respecting another human being means respecting their boundaries. Will took a deep breath. He let his fists uncurl. He stepped backward, up the stair, back onto the porch. He turned his body sideways. He cleared the path. Hank stopped in his tracks, confused. Will didn't look at Elias. He looked only at his wife. Abby, Will said gently, this is your home. This is your past. I am standing right beside you, but I will not stand in front of you. How do you want to handle this? Abby looked up at Will. She saw the absolute respect in his eyes. He wasn't treating her like a fragile lady who needed to be shielded from an ugly sight. He was treating her like an equal. He was giving her the power. Abby stood up. She walked past Will. She walked down the wooden stairs. Her boots crunched on the frozen dirt of the yard. She stopped 3 feet away from Elias Thornton. Elias looked up at her. His face was streaked with tears and dirt. He looked hopeful. He looked like he thought she was going to pity him, because she used to be the fat, desperate girl who needed him. Abby didn't feel pity. She didn't feel anger. She felt entirely, wonderfully empty of him. She stood tall. She squared her broad shoulders. She looked down at the man who had broken her pride for the amusement of a town. Elias, Abby said. Her voice was calm. It was clear. It didn't tremble. Elias sniffled. Abby, you always had a kind heart. You know I didn't mean to. Stop talking, Abby commanded. Elias snapped his mouth shut. Abby took a slow breath. She looked him right in the eye. I need to give you a very clear lesson today, Elias, Abby began. Her words rang out in the cold air. I want you to listen to exactly what I am saying, because I want you to understand precisely what is happening right now. You came here expecting me to save you because you think I am weak. You think because I am a good woman, I am obligated to carry your burdens. Elias shook his head frantically. No, Abby, I said, stop talking, Abby repeated, her voice turning hard. She stepped 1 inch closer. I am going to teach you the explicit truth about forgiveness, Abby said, enunciating every word. I am looking at you right now, and I am telling you, out loud, I forgive you. Elias let out a loud gasp of relief. His shoulders slumped. He smiled through the dirt. Oh, thank God. Thank you, Abby. Thank you. You are a saint. I promise I'll work hard. You did not listen to my lesson. Abby cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip. Pay attention to the words coming out of my mouth, Elias. I am forgiving you, but I need you to learn exactly what that means. My forgiveness is not for you. Elias blinked. The smile froze on his face. What? Let me state this plainly, Abby continued. I forgive you not because you have earned it. You have earned nothing. You acted like a coward, and you treated me like garbage. You do not deserve my grace. You do not deserve my pity. She pointed a finger directly at his chest. I forgive you, Abby said loudly, because I deserve peace. I am choosing to forgive you to release myself. Holding on to the anger and the shame of what you did to me in that church is like drinking poison and expecting you to die. It only hurts me. I refuse to carry your poison inside me for another single day. I am setting it down right here in the dirt. Elias stared at her. He didn't understand. His small mind couldn't grasp it. But, but the job? The barn? No, Abby said flatly. But you just said you forgive me. Elias, cried panic rising in his voice again. I did it, Abby said, her voice perfectly level. I forgive you for abandoning me. I forgive you for the humiliation. My soul is clear of you. But forgiveness does not mean freedom from consequence. The educational lesson here, Elias, is that forgiving a person does not mean you have to let them back into your life. You made your bed. Now you must lie in it. You will not work here. You will not eat here. You will not sleep in our barn. She took a step back. She crossed her arms over her chest. As of this moment, Abby stated with absolute finality, you no longer exist in my world. My forgiveness is a locked door opened, and I am walking out of it, and I am locking it behind me. Get off my husband's land. Elias looked stunned. He looked from Abby to Will. Will was standing on the porch. His arms were crossed. He nodded once. You heard the lady of the house, Will said. Hank, escort Mr. Thornton to the county line. If he turns his horse around, shoot the horse, and leave him to walk. Hank grinned. He gripped his pitchfork. Yes, sir. Hank walked up to Elias. He grabbed the man by the collar of his ruined suit. He hauled him to his feet. He shoved him toward the exhausted horse. Get up, Hank growled. We're taking a ride. Elias didn't fight. He was completely broken. The realization finally hit him. The woman he threw away was a queen, and he was nothing. He climbed clumsily into the saddle. He didn't look back at Abby. He couldn't. Hank swung onto his own horse. He grabbed the reins of Elias's mount. He led the pathetic man down the long dirt driveway, heading away from Dusty Creek, heading away forever. Abby stood in the yard. She watched them go. She watched until they were nothing but a small speck on the horizon. She took a deep breath of the cold November air. It tasted sweet. It tasted clean. She felt lighter. The heavy, invisible rock she had been carrying in her chest for 5 months was gone. She had set it down, just like she said. She turned around. Will was still standing on the porch. He was watching her. The look on his face wasn't just respect anymore. It was awe. Abby walked back up the stairs. She didn't rush. She moved with the steady grace of a woman who completely owned her own soul. She reached the top step. Will didn't move out of the way. He stood there, looking down at her. You didn't have to step back, Abby said quietly. Yes, I did, Will said. His voice was thick with emotion. I promised you a partnership. Partners don't fight each other's ghosts. They just hold the line so the other one can fight. Abby looked up into his deep blue eyes. She saw the truth there. You did good, Will, Abby whispered. Will reached out. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull her to him. He gently lifted his large, scarred hand and cupped the side of her face. His thumb brushed lightly against her cheekbone. It was the most tender, intimate thing he had done since the day they met. No, Abby, Will said softly. You did magnificent. He let his hand drop. He picked up the fallen wool blanket. He draped it back over his own shoulders. It's getting cold, Will said. Let's go inside. You said something about a roast for dinner. Abby smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. I did, Abby said, and potatoes, if you peel them. Deal, Will said. He opened the heavy oak door. He stepped back. He let his wife walk into their home first. The firelight spilled out onto the porch, pushing back the shadows of the coming winter. The door closed behind them. The yard was empty. The ghost was gone. The house was warm. December came down hard. It wasn't just cold, it was cruel. The wind blew straight down from the north. It howled across the open plains. It froze the creeks, solid. It turned the dirt roads into jagged ruts of ice. On the Sterling Ranch, they battened down. The cattle were moved to the sheltered ravines. Extra hay was pitched. The fires in the big house burned day and night. They were safe. They were warm. But out on the edge of town, things were different. It was a Tuesday morning. The sky was the color of lead. Abby was in the kitchen. She was rolling out dough for biscuits. Her hands were covered in white flour. The kitchen was warm. It smelled like yeast and hot coffee. Then a heavy knock hit the back door. Hank opened it. A blast of freezing air rushed in. It was Dr. Evans, the town physician. He looked exhausted. His beard was frosted with ice. He stepped into the kitchen, stomping his boots on the floorboards. "Doc," Will said. He stood up from the table. He set his coffee cup down. "What brings you out in this weather?" Dr. Evans took off his hat. He didn't look at Will. He looked straight at Abby. Abby felt her stomach drop. Her hands stopped moving in the dough. "It's your father, Abby," Dr. Evans said. His voice was grim. "I was riding back from the Miller place. Passed by his farm. Saw no smoke coming from the chimney. I went inside." Abby wiped her hands on her apron. A cloud of flour puffed into the air. "Is he sick?" "He's very sick," the doctor said. "Pneumonia, a bad case. The roof on his shack gave way under the ice 2 days ago. Snow is blowing right into the bedroom. He has no dry wood, no fire. I wrapped him in whatever blankets I could find. But his lungs are filling up. If he stays in that freezing box, he won't make it through the night." The kitchen went dead quiet. The only sound was the crackle of the wood in the iron stove. Abby didn't cry. She didn't panic. She turned around. "Hank," Abby said. Her voice was sharp, fast. "Hitch the covered wagon. Put a heavy canvas over the back. Load it with 4 thick wool blankets, a sack of coal and dry firewood. Move?" Hank nodded. He ran out the door. Abby turned to Will. "I have to go." "I know," Will said. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her it was too dangerous. He didn't tell her to send a ranch hand. Will walked over to the hook by the door. He grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat. He pulled it on. He grabbed his leather gloves. He pulled his Stetson down tight over his eyes. "What are you doing?" Abby asked. "I'm driving the wagon," Will said. "Will, you don't have to," Abby said. "It's freezing. Your chest is still healing. The cold makes it ache. I can drive the team." Will stopped at the door. He looked back at her. His eyes were steady. "Abby," Will said, "he is your father. That makes him my family. I don't send hired men to take care of my family. I go myself. Get your coat. I'll meet you in the yard." He walked out into the freezing wind. Abby stood still for 1 second. She felt a surge of something hot and bright in her chest. Then she ran upstairs. She packed her medicine bag, willow bark, mint, heavy jars of beef broth. 10 minutes later, they were on the road. The ride was brutal. The wagon bounced over the frozen ruts. The wind whipped at the canvas. Will drove the horses hard. He didn't speak. He just kept his eyes on the road. It took 2 hours to reach the Thatcher farm. When they pulled up, Abby's heart sank. The shack looked like a skeleton. The wood was gray and rotting. Half the porch had collapsed, and just like the doctor said, a large section of the roof over the bedroom had caved in. Snow was drifting down through the hole, piling up on the floorboards inside. Will pulled the horses to a halt. He tied off the reins. Abby jumped down. She didn't wait for him. She ran up the broken steps. She pushed the front door open. It was colder inside the house than it was outside. The air was damp. It smelled like wet wood and sickness. "Papa?" Abby called out. She ran into the back room. Thomas Thatcher was lying on a narrow cot. He was buried under a pile of thin, ragged blankets. His face was gray. His lips were blue. His chest heaved with every rattling, wet breath. He was shivering so hard the cot was shaking. Abby dropped to her knees beside the bed. She put her hand on his forehead. He was burning with fever. "Papa," Abby whispered. "I'm here." Thomas opened his eyes. They were glassy, unfocused. He coughed, a deep, wet, agonizing sound. Will stepped into the room. He carried an armful of dry firewood from the wagon. He took one look at the hole in the roof. He looked at the snow blowing in onto the old man's bed. He didn't say a word. He walked to the stone fireplace. It was dead and cold. He dropped the wood. He grabbed a handful of dry kindling. He struck a match. Within 2 minutes, a fire was blazing. "Get him warm?" Will said to Abby. "Get that broth down his throat." "What are you going to do?" Abby asked. Will looked up at the hole in the roof. "I'm going to fix that." "Will no," Abby said, standing up. "It's icing over. You'll slip. You'll tear the stitches in your chest." "Keep him warm," Will repeated. It wasn't an argument. It was a promise. Will walked out of the room. Abby heard the heavy thud of his boots. She heard him rummaging in the wagon. She turned back to her father. She pulled the thick wool blankets she had brought over his shivering body. She poured hot broth from a thermos into a tin cup. She lifted his head. "Drink, Papa," she urged, "just a little." Outside, the sound of a hammer began. Bang, bang. Abby looked up at the ceiling. Will had climbed up onto the frozen, rotting roof. The wind was howling. The ice was slick. The temperature was dropping. But Will Sterling, the richest cattle baron in Dusty Creek, didn't stop. He dragged a heavy canvas tarp over the hole. He nailed it down. He found spare planks of wood in the collapsed barn. He dragged them up the ladder. He hammered them over the canvas, sealing the gap tight against the winter storm. Every swing of the hammer had to hurt. Abby knew it. His chest was still tight. The muscles were still knitting together. But he didn't stop. The hammering went on for an hour. Inside, the fire roared. The room began to heat up. The snow on the floorboards melted into puddles. Thomas stopped shivering. His breathing slowed down. The violent rattling eased. The front door opened. Will walked back in. He was a mess. His expensive coat was torn. His hands were scraped and bleeding from the frozen wood. His face was red from the biting wind. He was breathing hard. He looked exhausted. He carried another massive load of firewood in his arms. He dropped it by the hearth. He took off his hat. He brushed the snow from his shoulders. He walked over to the cot. "How is he?" Will asked. His voice was hoarse. "The fever is breaking," Abby said softly. "The room is warm now." The snow stopped coming in. She looked at Will's bleeding knuckles. She reached out. She took his cold, rough hand in hers. "You fixed it," she whispered. "It'll hold through the winter," Will said. On the bed, Thomas stirred. The warmth of the fire had finally seeped into his bones. The hot broth had cleared his throat. He opened his eyes. This time they were clear. He looked at Abby. He smiled weakly. "My girl." Then Thomas looked past her. He saw Will. He saw the dirt smeared across the rich man's face. He saw the bleeding knuckles. He saw the torn coat. He looked up at the ceiling. He saw the new planks blocking out the storm. Thomas realized what had happened. The old man's face crumbled. Tears welled up in his eyes. Not tears of gratitude. Tears of deep, agonizing shame. Thomas tried to push himself up on his elbows. He was too weak. He fell back against the pillow. He looked away from Will. He stared at the wall. "I'm sorry," Thomas choked out. His voice was thick with humiliation. "I am so sorry, Mr. Sterling." Will frowned. He stepped closer to the bed. "Sorry for what, Thomas?" Thomas squeezed his eyes shut. A tear leaked out and rolled into his gray beard. "Look at this place," Thomas whispered. "Look at me. I have nothing. I am a dirt-poor failure. I couldn't even keep a roof over my own head. And now I have dragged you out here in the freezing cold, the finest man in the county, doing the work of a hired servant. Patching my rotting roof with your bare hands. It ain't right. You shouldn't have to lower yourself to do servant's work for a poor man like me. I am ashamed. I am so deeply ashamed." The room fell silent. Only the crackle of the fire spoke. Abby felt her heart ache. She knew that shame. She had lived with it her whole life. The shame of having dirty hands in a town of clean suits. Will didn't move away. He didn't offer a polite smile. He didn't brush it off. Will pulled a wooden chair right up to the side of the cot. He sat down, leaned forward. He rested his bleeding hands on his knees. "Thomas," Will said. His voice was deep. It filled the small room. Thomas kept his eyes squeezed shut. "Please, sir, go home. Leave me be." "No," Will said. His voice turned hard. "Open your eyes, Thomas. Look at me." Slowly, the old man opened his eyes. He looked at the wealthy rancher. "I need to give you a very clear, explicit lesson right now," Will began. His words were slow, deliberate. They left no room for argument. "I want you to listen carefully to the words I am saying, because you have a completely wrong idea about what makes a man valuable." Will pointed a finger at the old man's chest. "I want to teach you the explicit truth about human equality," Will stated firmly. "Let me be entirely clear. Wealth does not buy dignity. A bank account does not make a man superior. And poverty does not make a man worthless. You think because I have money and land, I am somehow above fixing a roof. You are wrong. Hard labor is not a humiliation. It is an honor. It is how we care for the people we love." Thomas stared at him, his breath hitching. Will leaned in closer. His eyes locked onto the old farmer's face. "Listen to this lesson, Thomas," Will continued, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "You worked this hard, unforgiving dirt your entire life. You broke your back to feed your daughter. You raised a woman who is strong, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. You raised the woman who saved my life. That makes you a wealthy man in the only currency that actually matters. Character, integrity, love." Will reached out. He placed his large bleeding hand directly over Thomas' frail, trembling hand. He held it tight. "Let me state this plainly," Will said. "There are no classes in this family. There are no masters and servants here. You are not a burden. You are my father-in-law. You are my family, and family takes care of each other. I did not lower myself today. I raised myself up by earning the right to take care of you. Do you understand the lesson I am teaching you? You will never be ashamed of your life in front of me again. You are my equal. Period." Thomas stared up at Will. His lips trembled. The deep, heavy shame that had weighed him down for 30 years began to crack. It splintered. It broke apart under the weight of Will's absolute truth. Thomas turned his hand over. He gripped Will's bleeding fingers. He held on tight. "I understand," Thomas whispered, tears flowing freely down his face now. "I hear your lesson, Will. Thank you. Thank you, son." Will nodded. He didn't pull his hand away. "Get some sleep, Thomas," Will said gently. "We're going to stay the night. We'll keep the fire going. In the morning, when the storm breaks, we are wrapping you up. We are taking you back to the ranch. You are moving into the house. Mother needs someone to argue with over the chessboard, and you are not living in this shack another winter. That is a fact." Thomas didn't argue. He just nodded, closing his eyes. A look of profound peace settled over his worn face. Will stood up. He walked back to the fireplace. He tossed another log onto the flames. Abby watched him from across the room. She looked at the dirt on his face, the blood on his hands. She listened to the incredible educational truth he had just spoken out loud to her father. Will Sterling hadn't just fixed a broken roof today. He had fixed a broken man. Will turned away from the fire. He looked at Abby. He didn't swagger. He didn't look proud. He just looked like a man who was tired and wanted his wife. Abby walked over to him. She didn't say a word. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out a clean white handkerchief. She took Will's bleeding right hand. She carefully wiped the dirt away from his knuckles. She wrapped the white cloth tight around his hand, tying a knot at his wrist. Will watched her hands working. "You're a stubborn man, Will Sterling," Abby whispered. "I know," Will said. Abby looked up into his eyes. "But you are the best man I have ever known," she said. Will didn't smile. The intensity in his eyes was too deep for a smile. He raised his left, uninjured hand. He touched the side of her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Partners, Abby," Will whispered back. "Equals." They stood by the fire as the winter wind battered the shack outside. But inside, the cold couldn't touch them. They had built a wall against it, a wall made of truth, respect, and a love that was stronger than any storm. March arrived with a thaw. The ice melted. The creek swelled, swallowed the wagon wheels up to the axles. But the mud wasn't the biggest problem. Arthur Vance was. He rolled into Dusty Creek on a private stagecoach. He wore a gray silk suit. He smoked cigars that smelled like burnt sugar. He represented the Texas and Pacific Railway, and he wanted land. He didn't just want any land. He wanted the low ravines of the Sterling Ranch. He wanted the water rights. He wanted the flat valley where Will's cattle grazed. Will said no. Vance didn't like the word. No, he was a man who crushed obstacles. It started quietly. The cattle buyers from Dallas suddenly canceled their spring contracts. Then the feed suppliers doubled their prices. Will spent his evenings in his study. The heavy oak door stayed shut. He sat behind his desk. He stared at ledgers. The dark circles under his eyes came back. He rubbed his temples. He drank his coffee, black and bitter. Abby noticed. She didn't miss a thing. She walked into his study on a Thursday night. The fire was dying. The room was cold. Will was hunched over a stack of bank papers. He tried to slide a folder over the papers when she walked in. He was too slow. "What are you hiding, Will?" "Abel," he asked. She didn't raise her voice. "Nothing," Will said. He rubbed his eyes. "Just business. It's complicated. Don't worry about it." Abby walked over to the desk. She didn't ask permission. She reached out. She pulled the folder away. Will tensed. "Abby, stop. It's ranch business." Abby looked at the papers. They were foreclosure warnings, bank drafts, call-in notices on his massive operating loans. Vance had bought the debt, all of it. He was calling the notes due immediately. If Will couldn't pay $40,000 in cash by Friday, the bank would take the ranch. They'd take the house. They would take the land. Abby set the papers down. She looked at her husband. He looked defeated. He looked like a man carrying a mountain on his back. "Why didn't you tell me?" Abby asked. Will stood up. He walked up to the window. He stared out into the dark yard. "Because it is my problem," Will said. His voice was tight. "I built this ranch. I signed those loans. It is my job to protect this family. I didn't want you to worry. You have enough to do." Abby felt a flash of anger, not at the debt, at him. She walked over to him. She grabbed his arm. She turned him around to face her. "I need to give you a very clear, explicit lesson right now. William Sterling," Abby said. Her voice was firm. It was loud in the quiet room. "I want you to listen to the words I am saying. You are making a terrible mistake about what marriage means." Will frowned. "I am trying to protect you." I did not ask for a bodyguard, Abby snapped back. I asked for a partner. Let me state this educational truth to you plainly. A marriage is not a place where one person carries all the weight while the other person is kept in the dark. That is not protection. That is exclusion. It is a violation of our equality. She pointed a finger at his chest. I want to teach you exactly what a partnership is, Abby continued. A partnership means we share the harvest and we share the drought. If this ranch goes down, we go down together. But you do not get to suffer alone just because you are a man. You do not get to steal my right to fight for my own home. When you hide a crisis from me, you are telling me that you do not respect my intelligence or my strength. Do you understand the lesson I am giving you? Stop trying to be a solitary hero. You are my husband. Let me help you carry the load. Will stared at her. The stubborn pride in his jaw slowly melted. He let out a long, heavy breath. I don't know how to fix this, Abby, Will admitted. The words sounded like they tasted like ash. Vance cornered me. I don't have the cash. The herd isn't ready to sell. We are going to lose everything. Abby didn't flinch. She just nodded. Go to bed, Will, Abby said. Get some sleep. Sleep, Will laughed, a harsh, dry sound. The bank takes the land tomorrow at noon. Go to sleep, Abby repeated. I will handle the bank. Will looked confused, but he was too exhausted to argue. He went upstairs. Abby didn't sleep. She went to her room. She opened the bottom drawer of her dresser. She pulled out a small, locked tin box. It held the only thing her mother had left her. Not jewelry, not silk, a faded piece of paper, a deed to a worthless-looking stretch of rocky land back east. Except it wasn't worthless. Abby knew something Arthur Vance didn't. 2 months ago, she had read an article in a Dallas newspaper. A massive underground aquifer had been discovered right beneath that exact county back east. Water was gold. The railroad needed water. Abby sat at the kitchen table. She wrote a telegram to a land broker in Dallas. She rode out at dawn to send it. By 10 o'clock Friday morning, the reply came back. The broker had wired the funds to the Dusty Creek Bank. The rocky land was sold. It was enough. It was more than enough. At 11:30, Will stood in Mayor Cole's bank. Arthur Vance sat behind the desk. He was smiling. He had a cigar in his teeth. Mayor Cole looked nervous. Time's up, Sterling, Vance said smoothly. Sign the deed over. It's business. Nothing personal. Will picked up the pen. His hand hovered over the paper. He was signing away his life. The heavy bank doors banged open. Abby walked in. She wore her plain brown dress. She carried a leather satchel. She walked with heavy, solid steps. She walked right up to the mahogany desk. She didn't look at Mayor Cole. She didn't look at Will. She looked dead at Arthur Vance. She opened the satchel. She pulled out a thick stack of bank drafts. She slapped them down onto the desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. $42,000, Abby said. Her voice was ice. Paid in full, plus the early termination penalty. Your business here is finished, Mr. Vance. Vance dropped his cigar. It burned a hole in the carpet. He snatched the drafts. He read the Dallas bank seals. They were real. He stared at the heavy-set woman in the plain dress. Where did you get this? I want to give you an explicit lesson about underestimating people, Mr. Vance, Abby said loudly. The whole bank was listening. Listen to my words. You looked at my husband and thought you could break him. You looked at me and thought I was nothing but a slow, uneducated farm wife. That is, your fatal flaw. Intelligence and strategy do not belong exclusively to men in silk suits. True power comes from knowing the value of what you have and knowing when to use it. Now, take your money and get out of our town. Vance's face turned purple. He shoved the papers into his briefcase. He stormed out of the bank without a word. Will stood frozen. He looked at the empty desk. He looked at his wife. Abby, Will breathed. How did you? That was your mother's land. That was your only inheritance. You gave it up. Abby turned to him. I need to state this final lesson to you, William, Abby said. She stepped close to him. Listen to me. Money is just dirt. Land is just dirt. A marriage is living, breathing people. I did not sacrifice anything today. I invested in my partner. I invested in my home. We are a team. And a team does not let the other person drown, while they have a lifeline in their pocket. Do you finally understand? Will looked at her. His eyes filled with tears. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about Mayor Cole. He reached out. He grabbed Abby. He pulled her against his chest. He hugged her hard. He buried his face in her hair. I understand, Will whispered. I understand. Thank you, partner. They walked out of the bank together. They didn't hold hands. They walked shoulder to shoulder, like soldiers, like equals. Spring came to Dusty Creek like a promise kept. The year was 1879. The prairie grass turned a brilliant, violent green. The sky was wide and blue. On the Sterling Ranch, the sunflowers were back. They grew thicker this year. They lined the entire backyard fence, a solid wall of gold. The house was loud. It was alive. Thomas Thatcher sat on the front porch. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt. He had color in his cheeks. He leaned over a wooden chessboard. Across from him sat Josephine. She scowled at the board. You moved your knight to the wrong square, you stubborn old mule, Josephine snapped. Thomas laughed, a real, hearty laugh. You're just mad because I've got your king trapped, Josie. Accept defeat gracefully. They bickered like old friends. The bitterness in Josephine's voice was gone. She just had a sharp tongue, but the ice had melted. She had someone to argue with. She had family. Abby stood in the kitchen. She was icing a massive carrot cake. It was the day of the Dusty Creek Spring Festival. The whole town was gathering in the square. Abby finished the cake. She walked upstairs to wash her hands. She stopped in front of the tall mirror in her bedroom. She looked at herself. She hadn't lost weight. She was still a big, heavy woman. Her shoulders were wide. Her waist was thick. The Texas sun had baked her skin in brown. Her hands were still rough and calloused from working the garden. But as she looked in the glass, she didn't see the frightened, humiliated girl who had stood crying at the altar a year ago. She saw a woman who had pulled a man back from the edge of grief. She saw a woman who had saved a 2,000-acre ranch from a railroad tycoon. She saw a partner. Will walked into the bedroom. He was dressed in a dark blue suit. He looked handsome. He looked rested. The deep, agonizing lines around his mouth were entirely gone. He walked up behind her. He looked at their reflection in the mirror. You ready? Will asked. I am, Abby said. They loaded the wagon. They drove into town. Dusty Creek was bustling. Lanterns were strung across the main street. Fiddlers were tuning up on a wooden stage. Tables were piled high with food. When the Sterling wagon pulled up, the town didn't go silent. They didn't point. They didn't whisper cruel jokes. Instead, men tipped their hats. Afternoon, Mr. Sterling, afternoon, Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Higgins called out from his store porch. Clara Cole, the mayor's wife, was standing by the punch bowl. She saw Abby walking toward the tables. Clara immediately picked up a stack of cups and hurried the other way. She kept her head down. She didn't dare make eye contact. Abby set her cake on the dessert table. She felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around. It was Reverend Hopkins. He looked older, but his eyes were bright. Abigail, the Reverend said. He took her hand and shook it warmly. It is wonderful to see you. The town looks forward to your baking every time we gather. Thank you, Reverend, Abby said. fiddle started, playing a fast, joyful tune. People started dancing in the dirt street. Will was standing by the hardware store, talking cattle prices with some ranchers, but his eyes kept finding Abby in the crowd. Later in the afternoon, the music stopped. Reverend Hopkins climbed up onto the wooden stage. He clapped his hands for attention. The town gathered around. Will walked over and stood right beside Abby. "Friends," Reverend Hopkins called out. His voice boomed over the crowd. "Before we eat, I want to take a moment to reflect on the year we have had. We have survived winter storms. We have survived the railroad companies trying to steal our land." The crowd murmured in agreement. "But more importantly," the Reverend continued, "we have survived our own ignorance." The crowd went quiet. Reverend Hopkins looked directly at Abby. He didn't point, but his gaze was clear. "I want to deliver a very explicit lesson to this town today," Reverend Hopkins said loudly. "I want every man, woman, and child to listen to the words I am saying. A year ago, in my church, many of us laughed at a woman based entirely on her physical appearance. We judged her worth by her size. We were fools." A few people in the crowd looked down at their boots in shame. "I am standing here to state an educational truth," the Reverend proclaimed. "True human worth has absolutely nothing to do with vanity. It has nothing to do with the shape of a body or the clothes on your back. True value is measured by the courage to face cruelty with dignity. It is measured by the strength to forgive. It is measured by the willingness to sacrifice your own inheritance to save your family." We thought we were looking down on a farm girl. We were actually looking up at the strongest pillar in this community. We must learn to respect character, not costumes. That is the lesson God gave Dusty Creek this year. The Reverend raised a glass of Sass cider. "To Abigail Sterling," he said. The town raised their glasses. "To Abigail," they echoed. It wasn't a joke. It was a genuine, respectful cheer. Abby felt her throat tighten. She didn't cry. She just smiled and nodded her head in return. Will leaned down. He put his lips right next to her ear. They finally caught up to what I knew on day one. The music started again. Will took her hand. He didn't ask. He just led her out into the center of the street. They danced. They weren't graceful. Will's boots were heavy. Abby's steps were sturdy. But they moved together in perfect rhythm. When the sun started to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, they left the festival. They drove the wagon back to the ranch. The house was quiet. Thomas and Josephine were already asleep. Will and Abby walked around to the back of the house. They stood by the garden. The giant sunflowers bowed their heads slightly in the evening breeze. Will took off his hat. He set it on the fence post. He turned to Abby. He didn't offer a grand, poetic speech. He was a cowboy. He spoke the plain truth. "I need to state one last fact to you, Abby Will," said softly in the twilight. "Listen to me carefully. I was a dead man walking when I met you. I was drowning in a house full of ghosts. You didn't just save my ranch. You saved my life." He stepped closer. He wrapped his arms around her wide waist. He pulled her flush against his chest. "Thank you," Will whispered into her hair. "Thank you for bringing me home." Abby wrapped her strong arms around his neck. She rested her head against his shoulder. She listened to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "We built it together, partner," Abby said. They stood there in the quiet Texas night. The wind rustled through the sunflowers. The chubby bride and the handsome cowboy, equals in the dirt, equals in the light, and finally, entirely at peace. If this story gave you hope, please like, comment, share it with others, and subscribe so you will not miss the next emotional Western tale. This story is designed as cinematic long-form entertainment and may contain exaggerated emotions, dramatic coincidences, or heightened tension to create a more engaging experience for viewers. Certain scenes have been intentionally intensified for storytelling and emotional impact.
In the end, Abby Thatcher's story is not simply about a woman who was humiliated at the altar, nor is it only about a lonely cowboy who gave her a second chance. It is a story about human dignity, about the quiet strength that lives inside people the world is too quick to judge. Abby was mocked for her appearance, rejected in front of an entire town, and treated as though her heart was worth less because her body did not fit their idea of beauty. But she did not let cruelty define her. She kept standing. She kept working. She kept speaking the truth, even when her voice trembled inside. And through her courage, she taught everyone around her that a person's value is not measured by a dress size, a pretty face, a bank account, or the approval of a gossiping crowd. True worth is measured by character, loyalty, compassion, honesty, and the strength to remain kind without becoming weak. Will Sterling also learned something important. He thought he was saving Abby, but in many ways, Abby saved him too. She helped him face the grief he had buried, the guilt he had carried, and the silence that had slowly hardened his heart. Their love did not begin with passion or pretty promises. It began with respect. It began with two wounded people choosing to stand beside each other as equals. That is one of the deepest lessons of this story. Real love is not about owning someone, rescuing someone, or changing someone into what we want them to be. Real love is partnership. It is listening. It is honoring another person's pain, boundaries, past, and dreams. It is holding the line for someone when they must face their own ghosts. This story also reminds us that forgiveness is powerful, but forgiveness does not mean allowing people to hurt us again. Abby forgave Elias, not because he deserved it, but because she deserved peace. She released the shame he had placed on her, but she did not open the door for him to return and take from her again. That is a lesson many hearts need to hear. Forgiveness can free your soul, but it does not require you to forget the truth, ignore consequences, or invite cruelty back into your life. And perhaps the greatest message of all is this: never underestimate the people the world overlooks. The person others laugh at may be the one with the strongest heart. The person others dismiss may be the one who saves a family, heals a home, and teaches an entire town what dignity really means. Abby did not become worthy because Will chose her. She was worthy all along. Will simply had the courage to see it. So may this story remind us to look beyond appearances, to speak with kindness, to defend the dignity of others, and to never let shame become the story we believe about ourselves. Every person deserves respect. Every wounded heart deserves healing. And sometimes, on the hardest roads of life, love does not arrive like a fairy tale. Sometimes it rides in quietly, wearing dust-covered boots, offering a steady hand, and teaching us that we were never a joke. We were always enough.